Ladies and gentlemen, there comes a powerful moment in every healing journey when you realize you don't need them anymore. Not because you're cold or unkind, but because you've remembered who you are. When you stop seeking validation from someone who uses your insecurities as leverage, something shifts. It's not revenge, it's not ego, it's self-worth. This moment, the narcissist's realization that their power over you is gone, isn't just a turning point, it's a revolution of the soul. Narcissist finally realizes that you no longer need them. It is not just a change in your relationship, it is a seismic shift in your emotional landscape. The power dynamics that once defined the connection begin to crumble because the foundation of control no longer exists. That control often thrived on your need for affirmation, your desire to be seen, loved, and accepted, especially by someone you once placed on a pedestal. But when you begin to stand in your vulnerability, not as something to be hidden or apologized for, but as a source of strength, you are no longer operating in their framework. Vulnerability, in its truest form, is not about weakness, it's about truth. It's about standing in the raw, messy reality of your emotions without performing for someone else's comfort or approval. And once you discover that truth, you begin to realize that your emotional world is yours to protect, nurture, and own. For someone with narcissistic tendencies, your vulnerability was once a lever to push and pull. They could use your fears, your need for connection, and your past wounds to maneuver you into roles that served their self-image. But when you step away from the narrative that says your worth depends on someone else's treatment of you, you become free. This freedom doesn't come from walls or emotional coldness, it comes from self-awareness. You begin to notice the patterns. You notice the moments where you used to shrink yourself just to keep peace. You notice the times you hesitated to speak your truth because you feared rejection or ridicule. And now you don't do that anymore. You speak honestly, you express your needs, you name your limits. That's vulnerability in action. It's no longer about being reactive to someone else's emotional climate. It's about honoring your own. There's a quiet courage in not needing the narcissist. It's not a loud declaration or a moment of revenge. It's subtle, even invisible on the outside. But internally, it's monumental. The voice in your head that once said, "If I just try harder, they'll love me," has been replaced by a new truth. I already am enough, whether they love me or not. That realization dismantles the power structure that kept you tethered to dysfunction. You begin to live for your own integrity, not for their approval. You begin to choose peace over performance. And what the narcissist sees now is something they can't manipulate: self-trust. This moment of realization is not always dramatic. Sometimes it happens on a Tuesday afternoon when you don't feel the urge to answer their message. Sometimes it's in the quiet morning when you look in the mirror and don't see yourself as broken anymore. It builds slowly, through small acts of reclaiming your life. And when the narcissist senses that shift, that you are no longer emotionally entangled in their validation, they become unsettled. Because your freedom exposes the illusion of their control. For so long, they believed you needed them to feel beautiful, to feel valuable, to feel worthy. But now you see that all those things come from within you. You were never lacking. You were just made to believe you were. This is the deeper truth Brené Brown speaks to when she talks about vulnerability and wholehearted living. It's not about fixing ourselves to be lovable. It's about embracing ourselves fully, imperfections, needs, emotions, and all. And when we do that, we begin to walk away from anything or anyone who demands that we earn their love by abandoning ourselves. That's the freedom the narcissist cannot control. They no longer have access to your fears because you've looked at them directly. You've held your insecurities with compassion instead of shame. You've stopped running from your pain and started healing it. That's how you became free. That's how you stopped needing them. Shame has always been a quiet manipulator in the hands of a narcissist. It's the invisible thread they pull to make you feel small, unworthy, or constantly in need of their approval. But what happens when you begin to recognize shame for what it is and choose to meet it not with fear but with self-compassion? That's when the dynamic begins to shift in a way that the narcissist can no longer control. Shame cannot survive being spoken. It cannot survive empathy, and it absolutely cannot survive radical self-acceptance. The moment you decide to stop internalizing the narratives that you're not enough, too much, or never quite right, you begin dismantling the very fuel that fed their power over you. Maybe even decades, you might have been conditioned to believe that your worth was directly tied to someone else's perception of you. A narcissist thrives in that space, subtly or overtly guiding you to question yourself, your feelings, your reality. You may have heard things like, "You're too sensitive, you always overreact," or "Why can't you just be more like?" These aren't just offhand comments, they are shame triggers. And if you were not taught how to meet shame with resilience, you likely responded by trying to fix yourself, to shrink, to earn back approval. It's an exhausting, heartbreaking cycle. But shame resilience, as Brené Brown describes, begins when we recognize those messages and choose not to own them as truth. The beginning of healing is often subtle. It can be as simple as pausing when that old familiar feeling of not good enough creeps in and choosing not to believe it. Instead of spiraling into self-blame or self-loathing, you start asking, whose voice is that? And why am I still giving it so much power? And in that question, there is a moment of clarity. You realize that so much of your emotional pain was not born from who you are, but from who you were told to be. Shame taught you that love was conditional, that acceptance had to be earned, that safety required submission. But now you're learning that love begins with self, that you can offer yourself the acceptance you were once desperate to receive from someone else. That safety can be found not in compliance, but in boundaries and self-trust. This shift is deeply unsettling to the narcissist, because when you stop believing that your flaws make you unlovable, they lose their ability to use those flaws against you. When you no longer hide your fears or pretend to be perfect, they can't manipulate you with guilt or superiority. Your emotional honesty becomes a shield, not a vulnerability to be exploited. The shame that once kept you quiet now fuels your authenticity. And the more authentic you become, the less room there is for manipulation. There's also a kind of grief that comes with this realization. You begin to mourn the years you spent trying to be what someone else needed while abandoning who you truly are. But within that grief is also profound strength, because it means you are waking up. You are seeing the pattern clearly, perhaps for the first time. You are no longer seeking validation in places that invalidate you. And that is the core of shame resilience. Not perfection, but self-awareness. Not control, but connection. Not avoidance, but courage. You show up for yourself with kindness in the moments you used to show up with judgment. You change the entire narrative. You stop waiting for the narcissist to see your worth, and instead you begin to see it yourself. You may still hear their voice in your head from time to time, still feel the sting of old shame wounds, but now you know that shame doesn't define you, it informs you. It shows you where you need more love, more understanding, more care, not from others but from within. In the eyes of a narcissist, your shame made you pliable. Your silence made you easy to shape. But once you start speaking your truth, once you begin living from a place of grounded self-acceptance, they realize something has changed. They no longer hold the key to your identity. You do. And once that truth settles into your bones, it's something no one, not even the most controlling or charismatic narcissist, can take from you again. Setting boundaries is often mistaken for rejection, coldness, or selfishness, especially by those who have benefited from your lack of them. But in reality, boundaries are the deepest form of self-love. They are the clearest expression of self-worth. And when you start putting them in place, especially with someone who has controlled, manipulated, or dominated your emotional space, it becomes a revolutionary act. Narcissists are often drawn to people who are empathetic, giving, and eager to please. These traits, while beautiful, can also make someone vulnerable to overextension and emotional depletion when not balanced with boundaries. When you reach the point where you no longer need the narcissist, it is often because you've realized that boundaries aren't about keeping others out. They're about keeping yourself whole. Setting boundaries can feel terrifying. If you've spent years catering to another person's moods, expectations, and approval, the idea of saying no or even not anymore feels dangerous. That fear isn't irrational. It's built from experiences where your voice wasn't respected, where pushing back led to conflict, guilt-tripping, or emotional withdrawal. Narcissists often react strongly to boundaries because they experience them as a loss of control, not as your expression of agency. But the power in that moment isn't about how they respond, it's about how you choose to honor yourself anyway. There is something sacred about realizing that you can say no without offering an explanation, that you can prioritize your needs without justifying them, that you can protect your energy, time, and heart because they are yours, not up for negotiation, not subject to someone else's interpretation of your worth. This isn't about building walls or shutting down connection. It's about drawing lines that make real connection possible. Boundaries aren't a punishment, they are clarity, and clarity is kindness, both to you and to those around you. Enforcing boundaries with someone who has used your openness as a way to dominate or guilt you, they will almost always resist. The narcissist may accuse you of being difficult, selfish, or emotionally unavailable. They might try to guilt you, bait you, or push your buttons in ways that once worked. But the difference now is that you're not responding from a place of fear or shame. You're responding from self-knowledge. You know what peace feels like, and you're not willing to trade it for the illusion of approval. The process of boundary setting is not just about drawing lines with others, it's about redrawing the map of your own internal world. It's about shifting from people-pleasing to self-respect, from over-explaining to quiet confidence, from emotional survival to intentional living. And every time you set a boundary, you're telling your nervous system, your inner child, your future self, we are safe now, we are allowed to take up space, we are allowed to protect what matters. For someone used to controlling you, these changes can feel like abandonment. But what's really happening is that they're being asked to meet you in a space of mutual respect, something narcissists often resist because it requires equality. It requires seeing you as a full person, not as an extension of their ego. And when they can't do that, when they push back or withdraw, your boundaries become a mirror. They reflect their unwillingness to engage in healthy connection. That's not your failure, that's your clarity in action. There's a quiet strength in holding a boundary. It doesn't always come with grand declarations or big emotional scenes. Sometimes it's simply leaving the room, not answering the message, or no longer justifying your choices. Sometimes it's trusting that the discomfort of holding your boundary is far less painful than the cost of abandoning yourself again.
This is how you reclaim your life, not by fighting back with the same tactics, but by refusing to play the same game. Boundaries are not about controlling the other person. They're about defining what is and isn't acceptable in your world. They are about creating the conditions where respect, safety, and real love can thrive. And most importantly, they are about honoring the truth that you are not here to be used, fixed, or controlled. You are here to live, to feel, to grow, and to protect the wholeness that has always been yours.
Authenticity is one of the most powerful threats to a narcissist because it disrupts the very foundation on which their influence rests. Narcissists operate through performance, control, and the constant crafting of a false self that demands attention, admiration, and superiority. When you begin to show up as your real, imperfect, vulnerable self, you are no longer feeding the dynamic that keeps them elevated and you diminished. Authenticity says, I'm not here to please you. I'm not here to earn your approval. I'm just here to be real. And that is a language the narcissist doesn't understand because their world is built on the need to impress, manipulate, and control perception. When you step out of that scripted stage and into your truth, it's like turning on the lights in a room they've spent years trying to keep dark. Living authentically doesn't mean being loud or rebellious. It means refusing to pretend anymore. It means being honest about your feelings, honoring your needs, and no longer minimizing your experience to keep someone else comfortable. Narcissists rely on your silence, your compliance, and your willingness to play a role. Maybe that role was the fixer, the empath, the peacemaker, or the one who always gave the benefit of the doubt. Whatever it was, it required you to suppress parts of yourself in exchange for conditional acceptance. But when you stop playing that part, when you begin to speak in your own voice instead of echoing theirs, you disrupt the dynamic entirely. There is a cost to authenticity, especially in relationships where image is everything. You might be accused of being selfish, dramatic, or unstable. But those accusations aren't about you, they're about the fear that your truth exposes. Because when you stop pretending, it forces everyone around you to confront their own masks. And for the narcissist, who often avoids any kind of self-reflection, this is deeply uncomfortable. Your courage to show up as yourself highlights their inability to do the same. Your willingness to be vulnerable reveals their fear of being truly seen. Choosing authenticity is not about trying to change the narcissist. It's about choosing not to betray yourself anymore. It's about letting go of the exhausting effort to manage someone else's emotions at the expense of your own. It's about realizing that the version of you that was easy to control wasn't the full you. It was a filtered, edited, and fragmented version built for their convenience. But now you've stopped editing yourself. You're letting the full story be told, and that is a quiet revolution. The process of reclaiming authenticity is often marked by discomfort because it requires unlearning years of conditioning. You may feel guilt for disappointing someone, you may fear conflict, rejection, or abandonment. But the difference is that now you recognize those feelings not as signs that you're doing something wrong, but as signals that you're doing something unfamiliar but necessary. Authenticity means trusting that your truth has value, even if others can't receive it. It means believing that your voice matters, even if someone else tries to silence it. The narcissist's discomfort with your authenticity is not a reason to stop. It is proof that your healing is working. When you begin to make choices based on your values rather than their expectations, you create distance, not just physical or emotional distance, but energetic distance. That distance is where you find your power. You stop reacting to every manipulation, every guilt trip, every attempt to pull you back into their performance. You begin to respond with clarity, with calm, and most importantly, with boundaries. Values conformity, especially in dysfunctional relationships. Authenticity is an act of resistance. It's saying, I will no longer hide who I am to be loved. That kind of self-respect sends a ripple effect through every interaction. Some people will rise to meet you in that space of honesty and vulnerability. Others, especially narcissists, will retreat, resist, or retaliate. But none of that changes your responsibility to remain true to yourself. You didn't come this far to shrink back into a version of yourself that kept the peace at the cost of your soul. You came this far to be free, and freedom only exists when you are living in alignment with who you really are. Healing is not always loud or visible. Sometimes it looks like choosing silence over chaos, solitude over performance, and peace over attention. When you begin to heal from the grasp of a narcissistic relationship, your entire rhythm changes. What once felt normal, constant tension, emotional roller coasters, walking on eggshells, suddenly begins to feel intolerable. The body remembers what it endured, and slowly, with gentleness, you begin to teach it that calm is not boring, that quiet is not a threat, and that you no longer need to perform for safety. Healing is not about erasing the past, it's about integrating it in a way that no longer controls your present. It's about seeing your scars not as proof of your brokenness, but as evidence of your survival. The narcissist often struggles the most when your healing no longer includes them. They were used to being central to your emotional landscape, whether through love, fear, longing, or even anger. But as you grow, their name fades from the center of your story. You stop over-explaining. You stop reacting. You stop needing them to understand your pain in order for you to heal from it. That shift is monumental, because healing, in its purest form, doesn't seek validation from the one who caused the harm. It seeks wholeness from within. And that wholeness doesn't require permission. It doesn't wait for an apology that may never come. It moves forward anyway. You begin to notice the spaces where your voice was silenced and gently start to reclaim it. You name what happened, not to blame or dwell, but to tell the truth. Truth is the soil where healing grows. The narcissist may attempt to rewrite that truth, to minimize it, to gaslight your reality. But healing teaches you to trust your version of the story, to stop doubting what your heart knew all along. You no longer spin in circles, trying to justify your feelings or prove your pain. You simply own it. And in doing so, you begin to rewrite the narrative, not as a victim who stayed too long, but as a warrior who finally walked away. There's also a kind of grieving that lives inside healing, not just for the relationship that ended, but for the parts of you that were never allowed to fully exist within it. You grieve the moments you silenced your needs, the times you betrayed your own intuition, the years you stayed small to avoid conflict. And yet that grief becomes sacred. It becomes the doorway through which your new self steps forward. It's not weakness, it's release. You let go of who you were forced to be so you can become who you were always meant to be. One of the most powerful aspects of healing is the return to self-trust. Narcissistic relationships are built on confusion, questioning your memory, doubting your instincts, feeling unsure even about your own emotions. But healing rewires that confusion into clarity. You begin to recognize manipulation for what it is. You sense the difference between love and control. You know when your body is saying no, even if your mind is still trying to rationalize a yes. Self-trust doesn't mean you never feel fear or uncertainty. It means you no longer abandon yourself when those feelings arise. Healing also brings with it a new kind of strength, not the kind that shouts or proves anything to anyone, but the kind that allows you to walk away quietly when something no longer honors your peace. The narcissist might interpret your healing as arrogance, distance, or revenge, but that's only because they mistook your survival mode for love, your compliance for connection. What they're really witnessing is your return to your own power, and that power no longer needs their validation to exist. This stage of healing can be lonely at first, because the clarity it brings often leads you to let go of not just the narcissist, but also the toxic patterns, relationships, and habits that kept you tethered to pain. But loneliness is not the same as emptiness. It's space to breathe, to feel, to rebuild. And in that space, you start to create a life that reflects your worth, your values, and your truth. It doesn't happen all at once. Some days it's one step forward and two steps back. But the difference now is that every step is yours, not manipulated, not controlled, not coerced, just yours. And that is the essence of healing, coming home to yourself and deciding to stay. Empowerment after emotional manipulation is not a sudden dramatic transformation. It's often a series of quiet, deliberate choices that begin with one powerful realization. You are allowed to live a life that is not defined by someone else's wounds. For so long, you may have shaped yourself around someone else's expectations, emotions, and sense of entitlement. The narcissist in your life likely expected you to orbit around them to meet their needs, absorb their projections, and serve their narrative. But when you begin to step back into your own agency, you no longer ask for permission to exist on your terms. Empowerment is the reclamation of choice, of voice, of the right to stand in your truth without being diminished. There is a particular kind of strength that rises when you stop needing to be understood by the person who kept you small. Narcissists often count on your desire to explain yourself, to fix the misunderstanding, to maintain connection. They use confusion and guilt as tools to keep you tethered. But when you begin to step into your own power, you realize that not every battle needs to be fought, and not every opinion needs to be corrected. Empowerment looks like walking away, not because you don't care, but because you care deeply about your peace, your truth, and your future. That quiet, resolute exit is more powerful than any argument you could ever win. Reclaiming your power also means becoming aware of the ways you handed it over, not with shame, but with clarity. Maybe you over-explained your decisions. Maybe you apologized for things that weren't your fault. Maybe you stayed silent to avoid conflict. These behaviors were often survival strategies, learned in environments where asserting yourself led to punishment or withdrawal. Empowerment doesn't judge those responses. It honors them as evidence of resilience, while also choosing something different now. It's saying, I don't need to prove my worth. I don't need to ask for acceptance. I already belong to myself. Another key aspect of empowerment is breaking the cycle of self-abandonment. In a narcissistic dynamic, you're often trained to prioritize the other person's feelings at the cost of your own. You learn to question your instincts, to doubt your reactions, to shrink in moments where you should have stood tall. Empowerment is the reversal of that conditioning. It's making decisions that align with your truth, even when they're hard.
It's validating your own experience, even when someone else refuses to. It's standing firm in your boundaries, not out of bitterness, but out of self-respect. This empowerment is not rooted in revenge or superiority. It's rooted in responsibility. You begin to understand that you are responsible for your healing, your energy, your story. No one else gets to write it for you. And while it's painful to acknowledge the hurt you endured, it's also incredibly liberating to realize that the rest of your life doesn't have to carry the same patterns. You get to choose something different. You get to build something better. Empowerment is not about perfection. It's about alignment. It's about living in a way that reflects your deepest values, even when that means disappointing others who benefited from your silence.
One of the most profound shifts happens when you start to trust yourself again. The narcissist may have caused you to question your memory, your perspective, your emotional responses. Gaslighting erodes the foundation of self-trust. But each time you honor your intuition, each time you validate your feelings, each time you say no when you mean no, you are rebuilding that foundation. Self-trust becomes your compass, guiding you through situations with clarity and confidence. You stop second-guessing your worth. You stop minimizing your needs. You stop waiting for someone else to give you permission to be whole. With empowerment comes a new sense of freedom. Not just the freedom from someone else's control, but the freedom to dream again, to feel joy without fear, to pursue what lights you up without needing it to be understood or approved by anyone else. You begin to experience peace, not as a temporary break between storms, but as a steady presence that you protect and prioritize. And perhaps most importantly, you stop carrying the burden of trying to heal someone who refuses to look at their own wounds. You release them, not with anger, but with resolve, and in doing so, you step fully into the life that was always waiting for you to choose it. The journey away from a narcissist and into your own wholeness is not about proving anything to anyone, least of all to the person who once convinced you that you were too much, too little, or never enough. It is about reclaiming your story, your voice, and your worth. When the narcissist finally realizes that you don't need them, it's not just a loss of control for them, it's a quiet victory for you. Because behind every boundary you set, every truth you spoke, every tear you shed, and every step you took toward healing, there was a fierce, unbreakable part of you that refused to disappear. That part of you is still here, stronger than ever. And from this moment forward, your life belongs fully to you, not as a reaction to someone else's manipulation, but as an authentic reflection of your strength, your clarity, and your freedom.